Hey guys, it's Sam. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I am Sam, as I just said, and I'm working on my fantasy adventure manga called Yield Treehouse. And today in this video, I'm going to show you how I plot a manga chapter for Yield Treehouse from start to finish using my beat system trademark. I'm going to be explaining how I use story beats to organize and structure my chapters. Because I'm doing a fantasy adventure manga, there's a lot of lore, there's a lot of characters, there's a lot of things to keep updated with. But even if you're not doing a manga in this genre, you could still utilize the way that I do this in your own story too. So let's get into it. To demonstrate how I do it, I'm going to use chapter 25, which is my most recent chapter for Yield Treehouse. So basically, you have a wider story. And that wider story, as in the beginning, the middle, and end, have a beginning and middle and end, a big overarching narrative. But within that overarching narrative, there can be many subplots, many small arcs, and many arcs of those small arcs. And each of those things has a beginning, middle, and end, right on down to an individual chapter themselves. And this is how I like to look at my chapters when I'm writing them and when I'm drawing them. I like to look at each chapter as its own sort of tiny little arc with a beginning, middle, and end. The reason why I use beats and the reason why I think that you should use them or be cognizant of them in your own work is because they help you create a sense of movement in your story. And every chapter or everything that happens in your story should feel like there's some sense of movement going from one point of the plot to the next. So that's my quick little lowdown on beats and why and how I use them. So let's get into the more specific how I plot the chapter using beats. So you can see here in chapter 25, and I did show this in my last video, that I have Notion, which is the program that I use to organize and plot my chapters. Now, I can make a whole different video on Notion. It's an exceptional tool that helps you stay really organized. As you can see, I have so many of my chapters outlined here, and it's just a great tool to use to keep yourself organized. So going back to chapter 25, I first start with my 3 beats. And yes, 3 is the number that I typically use. And the reason for this is because each of my chapters is anywhere from 18 to 20 pages. And I found that for my writing rhythm, 3 beat points, beginning, middle, and end, is the right amount for how I storytell. For you, this may be different. Especially because I publish reasonably frequently, not like Shonen Jump weekly level, but I'm about bi to tri-weekly in frequency of publishing. And so I found that this is a sweet spot for me. In this chapter, there's a lot of stuff that happens, and the details of the characters in the story is not as relevant to the discussion, so I'll try to keep that stuff a little bit zoomed out and high level and just explain the logic and thought process. So I immediately think when I start a chapter, what needs to happen? I usually know that where I'm going to place lore, because like I said, fantasy adventure, there's always going to be something new to learn about a character, about a world, about some kind of power system. So I know that's going to be somewhere. I want to place a bit of action. As you can see here, there's a clash. And that's because a lot of my readers do read shonen. And while I won't say Yield Treehouse is specifically a shonen, it does appeal to that reader base. So I tend to want to stick a little bit of action in each chapter. It doesn't have to be like a super huge fight, but that's one of my story beats. That's typically one of the beats in each of my chapters. And then the last beat going towards the conclusion, I usually have some kind of, increasing tension or complexity in reveal with regards to the story, lore, etc. So let's go over the first part. And here it's Ender Upseus argument. Like I said, don't be too concerned with who the characters are. If you don't know, that's fine. We're just going to go through using them as an example for me to explain. So when you're plotting your chapter, you should always have a goal in mind. And for this chapter, the goal is to investigate the relationship between this character named Ender and this shadow deity that is within him named Upseus. This picture, this is Ender, and this pink shadowy thing on his face, this is Upseus, which you'll see in a second. So when I'm plotting my chapter, the very, very first thing for each chapter is to establish the setting. And you can do that in a very simple way. You want to have an establishing shot. You want to establish the setting because this orients the reader to the location of where things are happening. So you can use like a literal location box. Like this is what I typically do. It's a very easy way to tell the reader where you're at. But more important than putting text location box, you want to have imagery that shows where they are. Now, some people may feel like when you repeatedly do this, it feels a bit formulaic. And I agree. But I think that it's necessary to have this formulaic feeling because at least I would say for the majority of time, because you want the readers to expect, okay, I know that in the beginning of this chapter, I'm going to be able to orient myself to whatever's happening. So I typically always start out with an establishing shot. Here's a good example from chapter, oh gosh, what chapter is this? 22. So this is also another example from a previous chapter of how I start with an establishing shot. And like I said, you don't necessarily have to put a location box, but I think it's critical to show at least a location of where the characters are at any given time. And this is that establishing beat, okay? So to show you the final draft, so before as you start plotting, you know your setting, you know where your characters are, and you know that at the beginning of your chapter, you should probably do whatever you need to do to show the reader where the characters are. So as you can see, that's what I've done here. And then I ease into the conversation between two characters. So like I said, the goal of this chapter is to highlight a relationship between two characters. And I do that by having a conversation that escalates. And this is how I decide to do that. This is more of a manga technique, if you will. I've made use of a double spread in this particular chapter, and that's because there's a very major character reveal in this chapter. So a good thing when you're plotting the chapter is to consider whether or not you have like major reveals happening and whether or not that character needs to be revealed, you know, in the earliest part of that particular chapter. All of these things are very important, but they all need to go back to the purpose, right? So this first beat is to establish two characters, Ender, the shadow spirit within him named Upsius, and their relationship. So this is the sort of exposition of this chapter. There's nothing particularly, I don't want to say there's nothing exciting that happens, but there's nothing particularly dramatic that happens, with the exception of the reveal of Upsius, who is a character that the readers would not have seen at all until this point. So I did want to take some time and do a nice big double spread for that. But the emotional goal for the very first beat out of the three is to establish their relationship dynamic. So my suggestion when you are plotting your chapters is to consider for each beat what is the purpose of that beat, and then to think about how much screen time you should devote to establishing what that purpose is. Going from this part, I'm thinking like a reader, right? So the reader has learned about Upsius, the reader has learned about Ender. So I now want to move into the second beat. Now this is the escalating tension, right? This is the middle part. So I plan something in my story that's going to allow for me to sort of increase stakes and tension. And I do this every single chapter. And you may say, well, what do you do every single chapter? Do you have like fights every chapter? No, because stakes and tension can be presented in a variety of ways. It could be characters having an argument. It could be a character losing something. It could be, you know, a variety of things that increase stakes and tension. But in order to keep the reader flowing through your chapter and flowing through your plot, you want to bake in a beat for an escalating tension to a variety of levels, right? So for chapter 25, the way that I did that was introduce this clash. So Ender and Upsius, they talk, they argue. There's a little bit of debauchery between them. And now I want to escalate the tension. So Ender is on his way to a genius scientist's lab in the mountains. And in order to get there, he needs to get past a particular person. And this is the Ender SR Ludo clash. Now, if you look at this, you'll see the same pattern as the one that I just previously discussed. I start with an establishing shot. And now, if you read the old Treehouse, I'm giving you my secrets. You'll know this now, okay? Whenever you see a big panel with an establishing shot, you know I'm moving into the next beat. I'm wanting to orient the reader to the next part. And I want them to know where the characters are. So to back up just mildly, prior to this page here, this is page 7. So prior to page 7, we have page 6, right? And this is a transition page. This page is transitioning me into my next beat, and the specific panel that's doing that is this panel right here. You can see Ender walking into the mountains, and it kind of implies that, you know, he's kind of trekking through the mountains here. So this panel is the transition panel that's taken me into the next beat. The reader can kind of assume that he's walking through these mountains and he's going to the next spot, right? And that next spot starts with this establishing shot. So when you're plotting your chapters, think about how you can connect each beat, you know, and I recommend, like I said, for me, I do 3 beats because that's where my writing seems to kind of land on, but it may be slightly more or less for you depending on how you storytell, okay? So this is the tension beat. This is the beat where we're getting a little bit of action. A tension beat can be anything. It could be action. It can be an argument. It could be like romantic tension. It could be, you know, a character having an internal monologue that's very tense. There's no specific thing. It just has to increase the stakes in some capacity. So we have our establishing shot here. I know I have a couple of goals for this. And this is another thing I think I wanted to say. With each beat, or maybe I already said it, you want to have a goal. What is the purpose of this? You know, of course you could add things in your story that's just kind of for the hell of it. But I want to make sure that everything that happens in this story has some kind of purpose. So the reader always feels like they're getting something out of each chapter. So the purpose of Ender and Ludo clashing is to do one of 2 things. It's to introduce this character, Ludo, and it's also to demonstrate an ability that Ender has that the reader may not have seen up to this point. So typically with action, you know, action can have storyline relevance, and it should have storyline relevance most of the time. But also there can be situations like this one where there's not necessarily a deep plot reason, but you want to show off some mechanics or you want to show off a character. So for this second tension beat, that's my sole goal here. When you do your tension beat, I guess if there's anything, and I think I maybe said this like 60,000 times, but I'll just say it again. When you do your tension beat, if it's action, romance, internal monologues, whatever it might be, you want the reader to feel like some stake has increased. This is what makes there feel like there's movement happening in the chapter. And I also want to show something here too. This is the storyboard for when this character Ender uses this power that the reader has not seen before. And let me show you the inking because I think it speaks to something that's particularly important, which is that you could plan all you want and things will very much sometimes come out completely different than you plan. And that could just be, you know, the composition changing. And that's the case here, you know? So don't be so rigid in your planning that you can't, in your plotting and planning that you can't make changes, but be organized enough that you give yourself room to like make changes, whether that's like changes with the art or even if you have to add things with the story, which I will show you as we get into the last beat. Very last part of this tension beat is Fortress. Similarly to the last transition from the first story beat to the next story beat, Ender and Upsias arguing into Ender fighting this character Ludo. We had Ender walking into the mountains, that panel, to kind of show a transition, right? And just to remind you, I'll show you one more time. We had this panel down here, which kind of transitions to the next beat, and we get into an establishing shot. Well, I'm exposing myself. I did the same thing again, but this time the transition is actually an entire page. So we introduced this character, Fortress, and this breaks the tension beat, my second beat, and it starts to signify to the reader that, okay, we're about to move into another part of this chapter, right? It's signified through the introduction of Dr. Fortress, and it's signified to her saying, let's enter the lab. And to show the final inking of that, it's here. So this is kind of like a good area to mention that one thing I like about the word beat is it starts to feel like a rhythm. You start to feel and get a sense of, oh, okay, I'm feeling like I'm about to be introduced to what this lab is. I'm feeling like this character Fortress is about to explain some stuff because she says we have, she literally says we have things to discuss. So the beats kind of guide the reader as to what may happen next or what's about to happen next. And I think what that does is reduce the mental load that a reader may have reading your work, which is extremely important and very helpful. So we're getting into the final beat. And when I'm plotting this, I didn't actually write the dialogue out for this one. As you can see here, there's just bullet points. Now, I only occasionally do this. And to be honest, for this particular part, I should have written everything out because this is a very lore heavy part of this chapter, and it was actually extremely difficult to write. I'm not going to argue about whether writing or drawing is harder. I have my thoughts on it, but this was extremely difficult to write. I had to think a lot. So for my final beat, the way I like to do it when I'm plotting a chapter is my final beat always has one nugget that reveals something major. It could be, a character's identity. It could be a character's power. It could be something related to the overarching story that hasn't come out yet. But I like to lead into a big reveal of some kind towards the end of a chapter. Again, so the reader can feel like they're getting something out of each chapter, and also so I can move the story along. So how we're doing that is this character, Dr. Fortress, that I just showed you, she's going to tell Ender some stuff. She's going to reveal some stuff to Ender that has kind of been hanging around since like chapter 17. So I know this is going to be a big reveal. It's going to have a lot of lore, and I'm going to have to explain a lot of things. So we left off with this page, which kind of acts as a transition. And so if you catch my drift, if you catch my rhythm by now, you know the next page is probably going to be some kind of establishing shot. And ta-da, it is. So now a couple of things about how I plot and plan pages like this. As you can see, there's a lot of text on this page. One thing that's so important when you're doing manga, you're going to get to a point in your story, I feel, where you cannot avoid the amount of text, particularly if you're doing a fantasy manga where there's a lot of races and cultures and political stuff. At some point, you're just going to have to put the text on there, and you're going to have to hope that because the reader made it to chapter 25, that they don't mind reading all of this text. And it took me a while to get over that, but you got to get over it. You're going to have text there. The important part with this is you want to make sure that the flow of the reading direction is sensible so that the reader never feels completely overwhelmed. And I consider this when I'm plotting the chapter in Notion. I think about each line the character says, and I try to even add... I don't want to get too like in the nitty gritty, but I even try to add some kind of a rhythmic structure to how the characters talk to like reduce the mental load as much as possible. Yield treehouse is right to left. So I always want to make sure my bubbles flow in that reading direction in a really easy way. When the characters should be sit front and center, they are, but I want the text to flow with it, with the artwork. Okay. So here is the establishing page. This is the third and final beat. I know I'm going to be revealing some major lore here, but I want to make sure I establish the location, right? And so this is not, if I can critique myself a little bit, this is not the most telling establishing shot, but it's better than nothing. This is the interior or the entranceway of Fortress's lab. And there's a couple little cues here. I introduce Ludo finally, so I tell the reader, hey, this is not a bad guy. He is Fortress's bodyguard. And then I have taking a majority of the space on this page, the establishing shot for the entryway to Fortress's lab. And that is the only purpose for this page. This is the transition between my second beat and my last beat. And to show you the inked version of that, for more clarity, this is what it looks like when it's complete and finally inked. So this line that Fortress says here, this is my transition into her dispensing lore. So when I'm planning, I'm also thinking about those phrases and those things the characters that are going to say that can kind of seamlessly move me into the different parts of the chapters. And you also want to use your page turners for that as well. And this last a page turn is basically a panel at the bottom of the page that kind of like makes the reader want to continue and read. This page is one of the hardest pages in this chapter that I had to do because it is a lore dump. And I am not a fan of lore dumps, but as I said earlier, you get to a point in your story where it is inevitable and you're going to have to get your lore out. So this page, when I was plotting this page and when I was planning what's going to go here, I knew I wanted to explain some major high-level lore in the story. So when you're thinking of moments in your story that you're going to be dispensing high-level lore, you always have to remember what I feel is the key purpose of manga, and it's something that this book right here drilled into my head and instilled very deeply on me, which is that manga is to entertain. To be clear, we want to educate the readers on our world, but we want to make it entertaining. So every time I'm writing the dialogue and planning out how I want the characters to say what they need to say, I always try to remember, is this funny? Is it interesting? Is it intriguing? Because entertaining doesn't necessarily mean comedy. You know, entertaining can be a lot of things. So I know that there's going to be some panels that reference objects that are not necessarily with Ender, Ludo, and Fortress right now. So these would be like overlaid objects. And I think about that when I'm considering, like when I'm doing thumbnails and things. There may be some mobs and things like that. I think about how can I use imagery to storytell too. So I don't just want to have white boxes where Fortress is just kind of giving this information and the reader gets no visual. This is kind of the importance of comics, right? We want to use the visual storytelling too. So I tried to accomplish that here. And I also wanted to make sure that, you know, I add a little bit of levity in there because I like funny things. I don't know. I don't have any other big answer for that. And to show you what this page wound up looking like, there is what that looks like. Now, this panel, again, similarly to the last one, I know that I'm not quite done lore dumping. So when I'm, you know, plotting out this chapter, I'm again thinking about the lines that Fortress can say that will transition the reader into the next part of the lore dump. And this panel sort of acts as that. So I'm going to get just very briefly into the climax, which is the climax of this last beat is this page here. I'm not going to go too much into detail into it, but basically everything in the last beat works up to this page. And this, you go from the beat 1, which is the establishing the setting, establishing the characters that are important. And then beat 2, we're raising the stakes, we're adding that tension. And then beat 3, I give you a big drop of lore, and everything works up to this page basically. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that's just to explain how I'm kind of like mentally segmenting the beats and what they work up to. So hopefully by the time the reader gets to this point, they feel some sort of satisfaction, some intrigue, or something to that effect. Okay, so that's how I structure my chapters in a sort of 3-beat system. Before we finish, there's one thing that I wanted to say that I think is really important when you're planning a chapter, and that is you have to be open to, and this is a writing thing, you have to be open to changing what you originally wrote. Okay, so let me give you an example. I had this page here, this is a blank page, and this represents the fact that this page didn't exist in my storyboard, right? As I was writing, I knew that I needed Ender's character to say something very specific, to dispense something very specific. And when you're plotting, and like I said, specifically for fantasy adventure or any type of fantasy that has a lot of lore and a lot of characters, you know that there's going to be a lot of little things that you want the reader to know and you want to say to the reader. And at least for me, I'm always analyzing where's the best placement for this so that I can give the readers this information without overwhelming them or without making my story boring. And in order for me to do that, I have to stay really organized, number 1. And number 2, I have to be flexible. So this page I'm about to show you didn't exist at all. And even after it existed, I've changed the dialogue several times. So there is no storyboard for this page. This is the page that didn't exist. Now, it's not a very flowery page. There's not a lot of things going on here. We do have a detailed character expression, which in manga, one of the most important things that you can do is to learn how to draw convincing expressions in characters, but that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the fact that this is a very important page that didn't exist before. When I was reviewing my storyboard, I realized, I was like, I think I need to show the reader Ender's internal feelings about some information that was just given to him, right? But it didn't stop there. This is the first draft of what I wrote. And then I realized, this is a bit too general. I need to show what he actually thinks, how this information relates to him as a character. And further, I went and changed the dialogue again. Now, you may say, oh my God, Sam, you just added a bunch of more text. I did, but it's for a very important reason. And like I said before, I wouldn't worry so much about that so long as you know, you've gotten your readers to read 25 chapters. They're not going to mind reading a couple of sentences in a bubble, right? At least I hope not. So the reason why I bring this up is to emphasize that in plotting, you have to be flexible and you have to remove the concept or idea of rigidity from how you work because things change. And there are writing terms for this, but I do think this is the hardest part of making a comic. It's not the drawing, it's this writing piece. because of the fact that you have to keep track of rules you establish. You have to keep track of characters. You have to keep track of lore. And you always have to be analyzing what you've written and ensuring that you follow your own rules. So one of my biggest pieces of advice for plotting a manga chapter is to keep in mind that you should be flexible. Now, flexible doesn't mean retcon. It doesn't mean ass pull. It just means you have to allow yourself to make changes where needed to best tell your story. With that said, that is all I have today. If you'd like to read chapter 25, the links are in the description to Global Comics and YieldTreehouse.com, where you can see how that sort of flows and how that sort of works with regard to how I write the story. There was a lot of interest in the previous video that I did, so I thought that, and there were even comments asking about beats, so I thought this might be a good video to kind of follow up with that one. And I really appreciate you watching. If there are any other questions or advice that you would like to hear or see about how I'm approaching drawing and writing my fantasy adventure manga Yield Treehouse, leave it in the comments below. Maybe we can keep this like train going. And until next time, I'll catch you later. Bye.